Hello again, and welcome to our speaker series of the Soul Care program offered by Volunteer Hospice. My name is Astrid Waffen-Pellows. I'm the Volunteer Services Manager. I'm delighted to see such a great response for today's topic, Ritual Healing for Death and Loss, presented by Sarah Kerr. The size of this group speaks of the interest in how we approach end of life, ours or that of our loved ones, and how we are looking for ways to gain insight, to gain knowledge, so we can raise our awareness and become more accepting of the inevitable. It is also a way to reclaim what is ours, our body, mind, spirit, and soul, and to give it as much attention near the end or after our death as we do during our lives. For those of you unfamiliar with Volunteer Hospice of Pelham County, we were founded in 1978, and we are one of the very few independent hospices offering nursing care without a single taxpayer dollar and without limitations inherent of government-funded agencies. All our services are provided free of charge. Aside from the speaker series that is scheduled every other month, we are also hosting monthly death cafes called Tea to Die For. Tea to Die For are informal gatherings to share thoughts about death and dying over coffee, tea, and cake. One death cafe takes place every second Monday of the month in Squim, and the other one is every fourth Wednesday of the month in Port Angeles. All the details are on our website, volunteerhospice.org. You can look for the Soul Care program in the Death Cafe tab there. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to Sarah Kerr. I've been following Sarah for a few years, and I'm very impressed by her breadth of work and energetic ways to inspire us. Sarah Kerr has been in practice as a death doula and a ritual healing practitioner for about 10 years or more, and has helped hundreds of people meet death and loss in a soul-centric way. She has a master's degree in environmental studies and a PhD in transformative learning. She has been a longtime student of cross-cultural shamanic healing and nature-based spirituality, and has worked with many Indigenous and Western teachers. As she writes on her website, "My soul is fed in that place where pain and sorrow, joy and love are so exquisitely true and beautiful that my heart cracks open." This reminds me of the kintsugi Japanese pottery technique, where breaks and repairs become part of the history of an object by repairing the cracks with lacquer mixed with gold. It also reminds me of Leonard Cohen's words in one of his songs, "Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." So I invite you to listen to Sarah. I'm going to ask you to reserve your questions for the end, but she'll tell you more about that in detail. And Sarah, I want to thank you so much for being here with us. I'll let you take it from here. And if you'd like to add anything to introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Astrid. Hello, everybody. It is lovely to be here. I was telling Astrid in the beginning that I get asked to do these kind of presentations a lot, and I can't say yes to all of them, but my two criteria are, is it local to me, or is it a student or groups of students? And so those I always try and do. And you're in Port Angeles or in that part of the world, and I have just moved to Victoria. So I figured you fell into the local category. So I'll put you in my larger bioregional loop. So it's lovely to be here. And thank you for that introduction, Astrid, and for the invitation. Today, I'm going to talk about rituals. And what I'll do is start by giving a kind of introduction to myself and how I got into this, because often people are curious about that. I'll talk about ritual practices and some of the fundamental principles around ritual practices. And then in there, I'll weave some stories, and we'll also leave lots of time at the end for questions. And I know it's being recorded, so if people choose not to be recorded, you have your cameras off. Anybody who'd like to turn their camera on, I do appreciate it and love it, because it's nice to be able to feel like I'm talking to people. But if you want to leave it off, that of course is fine too. I'm just going to invite you to explore the bottom of your screen and the reaction.
I'm going to get the iPad and put it on there for right
And there we go, someone just got muted. On the bottom of your screen, or depending on what it is, you might see a little reaction button. There's a little happy face with a plus by it. And I want to just get a sense of who's here, so I know who I'm talking to. So if you click that reaction button, there are all sorts of reactions. You can pick any one you want. Raise hand is probably a good one. For people I can see, can you kind of see that? Give me a nod if you found the reaction button. Okay, look, I see some hands raising and some hearts. Okay, perfect. Okay, so clear your reactions. Now that I know people can use them, excellent. And I'm just gonna sort of call out some descriptors and tell me if you're one of these people. So there's a few still, Terry, Mary, Kathleen, there you go, you're deleting. Okay, so if you are a volunteer, a hospice volunteer, give me a hand raise or some kind of signal, just so I can see that it's. Okay, so good, looks like maybe quarter view, something like that. Okay, that's good. Now clear your, if you get nimble on your fingertips and your keyboard here. And if you are here because you're curious about ritual at the end of life, either for yourself or for someone you're caring for, so it's quite personal. Who is here with those kinds of, and there might be some overlap, you may answer more than once. Okay. Okay, beautiful. And so, big tenderness to all of you who are walking this path right now. It's a path that all of us walk with those we love at some point. And so I'm glad you're here joining us. So we'll clear the hand raise, and I'll give one more, because this often is a kind of group of people that show up in my courses. Are you a death doula, or are you a little bit curious about becoming a death doula? And maybe this is part of your curiosity of being here? Anybody with that as a, okay, beautiful. All right, see a few of those. Okay. And then the other category would just be anybody else who feels inspired to be here, which you'll all fit in. So it's great to connect with you. And thank you. That gives me a little bit of framework for how to approach this. So you can clear your hand raising, and I'll talk and tell some stories, and we'll just sort of move through the process together. So as Astrid said, I'm a death doula, and I have been working since 2012, around then. And I also am a trainer. I have an online school called the Center for Sacred Death Care, and teach a lot of courses through there. And if you're familiar with the world of death doulas, you'll know that it's a new field that's emerging. It's unregulated, it's emerging from the bottom up. There's not a top-down cohesive plan around this, how this is developing. So different people are stepping in with different kinds of skills and offering different perspectives on non-medical, essentially layperson end-of-life care. And different people are bringing it different directions, and there are people who come from hospice and are hospice nurses and then train death doulas from that perspective, and other people who train from other kinds of perspectives. Maybe it's about how to help someone kind of wrap up a life. Often it's called legacy projects. There's a lot of people working in that field, or people helping with all the paperwork and logistics of the physicality of dying. All those are really important ways to support people as they're dying, or as they're supporting someone they love to die. So people doing all those different things can have a shingle that says death doula, but they can be doing very different things. I also have a shingle that says death doula, and I'm doing a different model than most of those. And what I really focus on is the soul experience, the non-physical, emotional, psychosocial, interpersonal, spiritual, energetic aspect of what's happening. And I work with dying people, with people who are supporting people to die. I also work with this category of people who have what I call deathly issues. And often there are people who call me and they say, I needed to talk to someone about this, but I didn't know anybody else who I could talk to about it. And it's a big bucket. All sorts of things end up in that category. And sometimes it's some unresolved issues people have with they're dead, recent or a long time ago. I work with deaths that happened a long time ago and didn't get properly ritualized or integrated then. So I work with, people whose children or siblings sometimes died decades ago and it didn't get processed. I work a lot around abortion and miscarriage. I do a lot of work with pet death. And I work in the realm of the non-ordinary, maybe you could call it. So people are having profound dreams or visions or having a really strong sense of communicating with their dead. And they want to understand that or maybe deepen it or know how to clarify it a little bit. Or maybe somebody died and they might not have completely left and the doors in the house are banging and the lights are going on and off and they need a little help out. So that whole spectrum is where I live in this. And since the pandemic, I do less in-person work. When I was living in Calgary, which is where I was until October, I did a lot of in-person work pre-pandemic. And since the pandemic and the move, now I do primarily online. So I'll coach people as they're dying and often now do Zoom meetings with their inner circle of friends and family to help people come and be on the same page so that they can support each other through this. So as I said, for me, the veil is thin and this side and the other are all part of the process. And I call myself often clergy for the unchurched because I find people need often a kind of map for how to meet a death or a loss. And if we have an established religious or spiritual or cultural tradition to follow, that can give us some guidance. But if we don't have that, and many of us don't, I know I don't have it in my family and ancestry, way back we had it, but it's not sort of present for me anymore. People need some guidance. What do we do? How do we do this? And so if you fall into the larger spiritual but not religious category, and that's a big tent, and people I work with generally have a kind of nature-based approach to death and dying, and they're interested in broader questions of spirituality and consciousness. If that generally describes who you are, then what I offer is a kind of set of directions and a map and a process for developing spiritual community around death. Because when someone's dying, there comes a point where there's nothing more that can be done. Of course, that's the big phrase, but what that really means is there's nothing more can be done for their body. Their body is going to die, but there are a lot of things that can be done for their soul. And that the soul is fed by relationship, by beauty, by connection, by meaning, by all those things that move us. It's our soul that's moved. So the clergy for the unchurched is about how to amplify and support and facilitate those experiences of connection to each other, to what we hold sacred, to the other side, to whatever is going to support us. So I do that with clients, and I also teach death doulas and anybody who's interested about that process. And I have developed a series of soul maps that are, there are diagrams and arrows and letters, and you can really look at the maps. And I also have classes on each of them, looking at the experience of grief and loss as initiation, looking at what happens after we die. Many people have a sense that there's something going on and that we don't just end, but they don't have a framework and understanding of what that is or how to be in relationship with it. So I teach about that. And then also what's happening right at the time of active death when the veil is thin. There's a profound set of spiritual and energetic dynamics unfolding there. And if we understand them, then we can have some confidence around what's happening instead of sort of just being carried along and having death be something that happens to us. We can be participants in it, and we can collaborate with those patterns of energy. And this brings us to today's session, which is about ritual, because ritual is a way to collaborate with those deeper patterns of energy. There are different ways to frame it. For me, it really is a kind of archetypal path that no matter who we are, what our outer world or cultural or ancestral or skin color, all of that, at some level we die the same way. There's an objective reality to how body and soul separate. And then we layer different pictures on top of that, depending on what our cultural or religious patterns are. But we can touch down and we can all touch that same objective archetypal path of what happens as body and soul start to separate, as the other world becomes more apparent, as it becomes clear here that we're going to lose and leave the people we love. They're going to leave us or we're going to leave them. So those maps are all available. And so I'll just pop in the chat a link to a free downloadable ebook I'll give you that gives you lots of information, takes you to my website. You can learn about all of that. And I think for people who are either, as many of you are volunteers or curious about supporting people, or who are walking this path yourself, you'll know and understand that there's a huge taboo and a huge empty space around this, that we in the West sort of make death something that doesn't happen, or we certainly don't look at. And it's rare to actually turn towards it and say, oh, this is what's happening. How do I do this? We spend so much time trying not to do it, trying not to die and trying not to let the people we love die. But at some point, it's going to happen. When that happens, how do we engage with it at a spiritual, emotional, interpersonal level? So I call myself a death doula. Death midwives, death doula is really the same thing, just depending on where you are and how you choose to name yourself. And I like that image because it speaks to me of the systemic nature of what's happening. In Western culture, we're so individualistic. We have this we can see ourselves as separate from everything, but of course, nothing in nature is separate. And if we take a more systemic approach, we say there's something happening in a whole community when somebody dies. Then we start to, I think, have a more accurate picture of what's going on, and a more accurate set of tools can grow from that picture, from that map. So birth doulas, birth midwives help at birth. And so when someone is pregnant, they and the baby are one organism, one being. And at birth, they separate. And it's painful, and it's messy, but it's how life happens. That coming apart is part of the process of the life force coming into this world, and life body and life beginning here. When someone dies, they're also, and as they're dying, they're held in a community, in a family, in a network of friends, in a set of relationships with the land around them. We're never individuals. We're always part of a system. And when we die, that same thing happens. We have this experience of coming apart. And it's like at birth, there's the person giving birth and the one being born. At death, there are those who are staying here and the one who's moving across. And that coming apart can be painful, it can be messy, it's hard, but it's a natural part of life. And so when we think about that, at birth, we attend to the person giving birth and the person being born, because they're part of the same network. At death, we can think in the same way and say there's a web of connections here that's being altered for those who live and for the one who dies. And I would say for those who have already died, for the ancestors who've already crossed the river, they're also intertwined. We're leaving here and going there. So that coming apart happens between us and our community. And there's another kind of coming apart. And you've probably noticed I do a lot of hand waving. Every once in a while, I get a clip of just me talking with no words, and there's a lot of hands going around. So I have a different set of hand movements to describe this other one, which is our body and soul are together. And as we die, they separate. And if we have, in some ways, the luxury of knowing that we're going to die and the opportunity to prepare ourselves and prepare our families, may happen with some time, some slow time. That happens slowly. And there's a slow separation our body is finite. It returns to the earth because it just can't continue as a home for our soul. Our soul continues wherever it is souls go. So that separating is part of the process. Western medicine is really good at caring for the body part of that. Really important. You need to have big support for your body for pain and discomfort. But what we don't tend to have so much literacy in is what's happening for the soul as the body and soul are separating, and what are tools and practices when someone's dying and is conscious and available for this conversation. What's a process to actually say goodbye to your body and to begin to identify more directly with your soul? Because in Western culture, we tend to say we are our bodies. Measuring, we can feel it, we can touch it, we can weigh it, that's who we are. But when we die, that gets called into a question. Unless we have a new frame for that, it's hard to know what to do. So ritual is soul medicine. Ritual speaks through image and meaning and beauty. And rituals are the kinds of things where you can feel why it's important, but you maybe sometimes can't describe in numbers and letters on a spreadsheet, even in a sentence, unless that sentence is maybe poetry. Poetry can describe ritual, but rituals are those things that you just know they feel important. And just as a little example of what that feeling is. So my dad died maybe 5 years ago, and at his funeral, a woman came up to me and she said, "I'm Jennifer Thorsteinson." And she said, "And my father was a good friend of your father's." And I knew her dad's name all my life. I had heard my dad talk about his friend Ray Thorsteinson, who he'd worked with and who had died many, many years ago. And for some reason, I had never met him. And Ray had died 15 years earlier. And so 15 years later, Jennifer, who had also heard my father's name and her family, saw the obituary and came to the funeral. Right? And I burst into tears and she burst into tears and we both hugged each other. That's the kind of feeling, like, why does that matter? It just matters because it speaks to the soul. That was a ritual action on her behalf. She came on her father's behalf, for my father, for me, for our family. So those ritual actions are what really, when we have that feeling, that we know we're in the zone of the soul, in the zone of ritual. So just a little bit of background about how I got into this, because sometimes it can give some context. So I had a huge entry into this work when my dad had a stroke, which was 7 years before he died. It was a very intense stroke, and he was conscious, like coherent, but really incapacitated physically, and was in a care home from then on. So that was a real shock to me. It hadn't happened in my life like that. I hadn't had someone get sick or be really compromised like that. So that was a shock. And I really decided from that this is going to happen again. And I want to be prepared when he dies, when someone else I know dies. So he was really my initiator in many ways onto that. As in my career background, I've always worked with groups. So I've always been interested in collectives and facilitating and communities and that whole process of how we are as a whole. I did my doctoral dissertation on contemporary rituals and how Western people who are, most of us, quite divorced and separated from our own ancestral line of rituals, and often from the land of our ancestral ritual practices, how we can connect with, again, those archetypal ritual practices, which are different than the cultural expressions of them. How can we connect with the deeper archetypal aspects of ritual without appropriating other cultures' expressions of them? But it's part of the collective human lineage and birthright to be able to connect with these. But we need new ways to do it that are fitting for those of us who live here and now in cities with a mixed bag of ancestral lines. So my research was around how to do that to help people navigate the big transitions in life using those ritual practices. And as Astrid said, I've also done a lot of training in shamanism and energy medicine. And also I'm interested in, done a lot of social action and political organizing work, interested in the collective death and rebirth we're going through, that the way of life we've had in this contemporary society can't go on. And we're going to have to let some things die. And they're already dying, whether we want them or not. And so we need tools for being able to grieve and process and integrate loss, because it's going to come thick and fast for a while. And I would say we're already in it. How do we learn at the bedsides of our loved ones the experience of loss and being able to integrate and come through loss and apply that at a cultural level to be able to let go of what has to go? Because holding on to it past its right time isn't going to serve us. So I hold this in a very big kind of political, social, cultural lens. So there you go. I've sort of gone off my map, but that's the general framework for where rituals in my mind fit into this. I just do a time check. 12, 12:30, 1:30. We're going till 1:30, right? Astrid nod. Okay, good. Thanks. I lose track of numbers, but I'll make sure I leave lots of time for questions. So what is a ritual? One of my favorite definitions of ritual is that it's an action that means something. So there are two parts of those. It's an action and it has meaning. It's something we do. We might do it with our bodies. We might do it with our voice. You know, Jennifer coming to the funeral was a ritual. It's something that's not just intellectual or conceptual. It's embodied. And you can get a bit blurry because there's a place in the imaginal realm where dreams can also touch into ritual. But in general, it's an embodied, enacted gesture. And it's an action that means something. So the same action may or may not mean something, which would mean it is or isn't a ritual. If I take a drink of water, that's a drink of water. But if I take a drink of water, and as I'm taking that drink of water, I hold the intention of gratitude to where the water came from and how it came to me and how beautiful and clear and healing for me it is, and that this water serves me so that I can be in service in my community. Suddenly, that drink of water is a ritual. So I put a ring on my finger every morning. Many mornings I wear rings. In a wedding ceremony, putting a ring on a finger is a very different thing because it means something different. So when we're talking about rituals at the end of life, it's starting to attend to and really pay attention to the moments that are so significant at a soul level, that have deep meaning, and matching those with gestures that reflect and honor the meaning of it. So one of those that many people, of course, it's because of a classic archetypal one, is pulling the sheet over someone's head when they've died. I teach this all the time, and every time I do it, I can feel it. You can just feel what that means. There's such an energy of finality and completion for that. And so after someone's died, building up to that ritual action and making that action highly ritualized by giving it lots of attention, lots of space, the word's not really fanfare because it's not fanfare, but it's significance. You amplify its meaning. Everybody's standing around the bed. Maybe you've had a lot of different levels of conversation and circles and anointing. And then at some point, the time has come and you invite the person who's closest, the spouse usually, or the oldest child, or maybe it's two people, to reach forward and pull that sheet up. And so you imbue it with a lot of meaning because it has a lot of meaning. And when people do that, and they actually do it themselves, and they do it in a way that they've been prepared, so it's not shocking. They've been supported to be with the body and to process and integrate and touch and maybe put lotion on their hands or talk about or thank. they've done some integrating of the shock of death. Even expected deaths are shocking to our soul. And then at some point, and the art is not to have them do this before they're ready. At some point, they are ready. And at that ready point, then they pull a sheet over someone's head. And that's an integrating moment, because what's happening on their inside, they're ready, matches what's happening on the outside, they pull the sheet. What can often happen, and I'm sure especially folks who are volunteers, but people always have stories like this, that there's a kind of wrenching and a disconnect between what's happening on the inside and what's happening on the outside. Someone dies, and the family is there, and the nurse says with great compassion, let me know when you want me to call the funeral home. Take the time you need and let me know. And people kind of stand around and they're stunned and they're shocked and they don't know what to do. And there's no chairs in the room, and they're too out of their minds to figure out that they need chairs. And they kind of stand around for a while, and then they go home. And in Canada anyway, 3 or 4 hours later, the transfer service comes and that happens, but they haven't caught up. Or often if the death is at home, transfer service comes, wraps someone up, wheels them away, and people are shocked because they haven't really absorbed that they're gone yet, and suddenly their body's being taken. So ritualizing and slowing down all those core transition processes with gestures and with, in a way with, and again, this word can sound, I don't know, irreverent, but it's not, but with theatrics. There's a long history between ritual and theater. When we watch a theater piece or we see a movie, we can be transported. It can take us to a whole different realm in the imaginal world. We're out of the physical. We're in this imaginal realm. And ritual uses those same principles of theatrics. Color and sound and smell and regalia and tools to say this isn't everyday life. This is something different. This is significant. This is the beautiful little crystal bottle that I carry essential oils in with the sterling silver top that I bought in an antique store years ago. And this is what we use to anoint our dead before they leave. Right? It has the theatrical, that may be the bells and smells and color and light, but it may just be the facilitated significance. Okay, we're going to stand in a circle, and one at a time, each person is going to move forward and say their thing and touch and say goodbye to the body. It just gives it more drama in a deepening way. So ritual is a gesture that means something. And it's designed to do something. Rituals are pragmatic. They're not, there's a phrase, just symbolic, which I think is hilarious because symbolism is so significant. And we know, the Ukrainian president has a great grasp on the beauty and the importance of symbolism, how he shows up, how he times things. Those symbolic actions mean something. And in death, these symbolic actions mean something. So it's designed to do something. And what it does is the intention. So when we're doing a ritual, we always want to be clear what the intention is. If it's facilitating someone drawing the sheet over the head, the intention is to help the living integrate and come to terms with the reality of this death. If it's a ritual to remove a wedding ring, right? She's died. He put the wedding ring on her finger 80 years ago. And sometimes people want them to be cremated or be buried with it. Sometimes they want it back. So what's the ritual action to remove the wedding ring? I did this with a family, and she had a necklace that he'd given her that she'd worn for decades and a wedding ring. They'd met when they were 15. We took off her wedding ring, and in a ritual way, the eldest daughter strung it on the necklace and put it around his neck, right? So that's again, there's a feeling in there of why that's meaningful. And you have to search for the poetry and the words of why. But in that intention, there was a great ritual around the putting the ring on her finger and beginning the marriage. And this was the end of it in the physical realm. And so we ritualized that. What's the intention? To open, to close. And I often think of it like our lives are kind of turning on wheels. We go through this and this and this. We get born, we have babies. We just roll each of these turns and ritualizing each of these turns. This click, that click, this click. Someone dies. It's the last breath. They take off the ring, take the body away. Each of those are turns of those cogs, and we ritualize each of those with the intention of helping people integrate each of those transitions. So rituals do something, and they do it not in the way of three-dimensional materialist life where we drop something and it falls to the ground. That's the physical realm. They do it in a kind of energy medicine. The same way if you've ever had acupuncture or Reiki or any kind of energy medicine, healing touch, those practices move energy. And in a system, when someone dies, there's a certain pattern. The family is established in a certain way. And when someone dies, that pattern changes. They leave the physical and they transition to the non-physical. This pattern has to rearrange. That's an energetic pattern. So ritual helps that pattern rearrange. So when you're thinking about designing rituals, you're always starting with the intention, not the gesture. Often people think, well, I have a bell and there's a labyrinth and we have some rose water. Okay, let's make a ritual. That's stage 2 or 3. Stage 1 is, where is this system either stuck or where is it out of balance? What needs to happen to restore flow and harmony? Right? People are shocked because somebody just died. Even if they've been, dying for many months, there's still a shock. So we want to integrate. So the intention, which is generally around integrating, but let's say at a funeral, you have a different intention. The funeral has a few different intentions, but one of the core intentions of the funeral is, and the image I use is that we're sending our dead in a canoe across the river to the village of the ancestors. And so I often have people stand up when I'm officiating a funeral, and either in their imaginations or with their bodies, put their hands on the stern of the canoe and push. And most importantly, let go. And if the family has been supported all the way through, and if the funeral ceremony has led people to this, by that point, they should be ready to do that. They might not want to do it, of course, but they know that the person's gone and they know that there's a certain letting go. So that's a huge, talk about that turning wheel. The letting go is enormous. And that's the intention of the funeral rituals. We let them go. That's the intention. Then what's the gesture? How do we do that? And that's the larger ritual of the funeral. So rituals bring healing to a situation. And when you're looking for intention and what you're trying to you're new at this and you're thinking, well, what is the intention here? What am I trying to do? It can be useful to think of kind of 2 different categories, maybe 3. I mean, so one category has 2 parts. The first is, are you trying to connect 2 things that have been separated? Or are you trying to separate 2 things that have been put together? So that's a category 1, connect or separate. Category 2 is, are you trying to connect with something larger, right? Which is connecting with the whole as opposed to connecting 2 parts within the whole. So I'll talk about what each of those are. So are you trying to connect 2 things that have been separated so they come back together? So healing, and there's a beautiful frame on healing that says we're either trying to connect or we're trying to separate. We're either trying to bring things together or separate them from being apart. So if we're trying to bring things together, we I talked about the body and soul, like catching up, the inside and the outside. We want to bring, those are bring together. We want how someone is processing on the inside and what feels big and significant on the inside to be matched on the outside. So when a funeral transfer service comes in and very kind of matter of fact, loads a body in a plastic bag and zips it up and takes it away because they do that every day and that's how they've been taught to do it. That on the outside is quite like pragmatic and matter of fact, and pretty fast. On the inside, it's a profound set of shifts and changes. And I can't believe he's gone. I can't believe I'm never going to see him again. Those are separations. The inside and the outside aren't matching. So we want to bring those together. There's a physical speed and a soul speed, and we want to bring those together. Body care after death is another kind of bringing together. What we're doing matches how we're feeling. We're, instead of a wrenching, we're bringing those and we're aligning with them. So I sometimes think about it like a conveyor belt. And this is more on someone who's moving towards death. We want to be, if someone's dying and the conveyor belt is moving them towards their death, we want to be on the conveyor belt where it is, not trying to claw our way backwards and resisting being on it. We want rituals to help us be where we are and be where we are and be where we are, so that when the conveyor belt takes us to the moment of death for the dying person and the people around them, we're there and we can meet it as it's happening. If we're constantly running backwards, right, not letting the integration between our inner and our outer, then what happens is the conveyor belt still takes us, but we kind of slam against the wall. We can have a sudden death, even with lots of warning, because we have been busy not dying. And then suddenly we are dying. So rituals help us integrate so we catch up. And it's hard. It's hard. It's the hardest thing to prepare for our own death or someone else's death. And we need support for that. So there's no judgment if people aren't doing that, but we just don't have skills often and support to help people do that. So rituals slow things down so there's a connection between this and that. Or do we need to separate? And so the hands on the boat and pushing at the funeral, that's a separating. That's saying they were here and they're not anymore. I have a whole series of rituals I do at a deathbed after someone's died. And one of them was we do the rituals with the person and their body. And then I have the people move aside, the family, move aside and make another circle, not around the bed, but another circle here. And I'm not in that circle. And I have them hold hands or look at each other. And I just talk to them about the fact that this is the new configuration of your family on this side of the river. You know, grandpa's in the bed. He used to be standing in the circle. Now his body's in the bed. He's not in the circle anymore. He's crossing the river. You're here. And just that action of looking around and processing, like, okay, now we're it. He's not here anymore. That's a kind of separating aspect and ritualizing that. Otherwise, it can be kind of hard to really realize someone's gone because there's so much in us that doesn't want them to have gone. I worked with a woman who was a twin, and her twin died a month after they were both born. And I worked with her maybe 7 or 8 years ago now. And she came to me because she's 28 or something. She always felt like she was seeing the world through his eyes. Like she was always living her life relative to him, even though he'd only lived for a month. And so we did some exploration and sort of diagnosed energetically what was happening. And really what it was, but it became clear to us, was that he had died, but he had never been ritually supported to cross the river. And so in a way, he was still living in and with her. His soul hadn't made that journey, because most people do, but occasionally people don't. They stay here and flick the lights off and bang the pots a little bit until you help them get across. So he was here, and you can take this literally as an energetic reality, or you can take it even metaphorically. She was always living her life with a kind of guilt, and his presence was as a filter on everything she did. And so we did a ritual to separate those two. So those are coming apart rituals. The other thing, so that's 1 and 2. The other thing that rituals do is they connect us not just to like parts of the system, the different components of it, but they actually allow us to connect to the larger whole, to the oneness, to God, to consciousness, to whatever you want to connect and call that, to nature, to love, to compassion, to some bigger frame. And I often, when I'm working with people, when I'm working in a group, I'll often invite people to just go inside and find for them what that larger, sacred, trustworthy force is. And people name it different ways: love, compassion, community, nature, God, whatever. That's what we need. Because life and death and the mysteries of living and dying are so overwhelmingly difficult. We cannot face them alone. We can't logistically face them alone. We can't emotionally face them alone. And we can't energetically and spiritually comprehend them. Sometimes death is really awful. Sometimes there's a tragedy and a heartbreak and a pain that is just overwhelming. How do we make sense and make meaning of that? And from our small one person, one lifetime perspective, it's hard to understand how there can be a meaning that can be made that is healing with that, because it's just overwhelming. But if we can take our perspective and say, well, I don't understand it. There's some mystery involved here, but maybe I can trust that at some level, there's a way that this makes sense. Because from this level, I just can't figure out how it can make sense. How could this be so awful? But at a bigger level, maybe we can trust that it can make sense. And that can be, for many people, a really important part of healing. So rituals connect us to each other. They're ways, when people are dying, often it's the elephant under the rug in the family. People can't talk about it. Maybe, the mom and the sister talk, or the sister and the brother talk, or the mom and the cousin talk, but nobody talks to the dad who's dying, and nobody talks all at once. There's a way we're doing this all alone. Rituals of bringing people together to actually discuss this in a held ritual container, instead of everybody standing around the circle, pushed back against the edge of the living room with this big thing in the middle, which is this upcoming death, and no one knows what to do with it, and there's all isolation between. If we can have a ritual conversation that brings us together, then suddenly we switch things, and people instead are standing side by side in a group, looking forward at this thing which is really difficult. But when we're standing looking at it together, we can face it in a way that we can't when we're all backed up away from it. So rituals help connect us to each other. They, depending on how they're done and how they work, they can help connect us to the larger forces of nature. And there's so much teaching, in some religions, they're religions of the book, and the teaching and the wisdom is written, and it's in books and chapters and verses, and many different powerful religions have books of wisdom. Nature-based teachings and nature-based religious and spiritual practices use nature as the text in a way. We can learn by watching the cycle of the seasons, by watching the behavior of a certain animal or the tide, or all the things that are constantly being played out around us in nature. And we can tune into those and see them as teachings and guides for what we do. And we can start to see our birth, growth, decline, death, something, and perhaps even rebirth, as somehow fitting into the larger field of nature. Instead of being separated from that, we can see, oh, this thing I'm experiencing I can understand it and meet it better by receiving the teaching that nature has to offer me about this. How does the cycle of the moon and how it grows and shrinks and disappears, but then emerges again? How can that be a guide for me as I navigate my death or my grief. So rituals help us connect with that. They help us connect with this larger archetypal energy that I talked about that's guiding how death happens. So we can lean into it and cooperate with it, because it's not in opposition. It's not something that's an antagonist in this process. When someone's dying, there's a flow we can lean into, which is the flow of how death happens. It's hard and it's sad. It's enormous grief and enormous heartbreak, and sometimes physical pain that goes with that. But if we can plug into it and flow with it, we move more easily than if we're fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting it, because it is going to take us, whether we want it or not. So we might as well, it's a great phrase I love, which is unconditional cooperation with the unavoidable. When death is happening, we don't like it, but we can choose whether we're going to cooperate or not with this thing which is unavoidable. And so again, back to birth, when we come in, the way I hold and understand and experience it and imagine it is that there's some essence of us that is choosing to come into this world, that is in some way entering, and you can hold that as a kind of soul consciousness, non-physical part, or you can just say, once we're conceived, our body is growing. There's an energy that's deeper than consciousness that is bringing us into life, into form. It's the energy that orchestrates labor. It's the energy, and there's something that's pushing. And all through our lives, we're drawn. Our souls are drawn to this and drawn to that, and we grow and we work and we have children and grandchildren, and all the way through there's this draw that pulls us through our life. And if we're lucky enough to live long lives, we live a long life, and at some point that draw doesn't disappear, that inner force doesn't disappear. We can use that same force, because at a soul level, it is also what's carrying us out. So rituals can help us connect to that larger force, which is also something we can use to help direct and guide us through this process, to trust that we're not victims of this. At some level, this is our life's path. It may be unfortunately earlier, it may be coming in a difficult way, but for better or for worse, it's what's happening to us. It is our fate. So we can connect with those and learning how to cooperate them. So I'm going to wrap up now just with a little sort of last little bit, and then we'll open it for questions, because I really want to go wherever people are about this, so you can start thinking about what your questions might be. And I think we will actually use the hand raise, the little button on your reaction button. So I'll let you know, and we'll use a question. But I guess the last part of this is that healing happens when love can flow, when love is blocked. And of course, love and grief are really the same thing. We love as much as we grieve. So if grief is blocked, that's the same as love being blocked. If love or grief are blocked, it's hard for healing and integration to happen. And Laurie Anderson, whose husband Lou Reed died a beautifully conscious death. She's an artist and a writer, and she wrote about it in Rolling Stone magazine. Great spiritual text in there. She talked about her understanding of death, and she said, I've come to believe that the purpose of death is the release of love. And so if we think about how to die in a way that releases love, which is also how to die in a way that releases grief or allows grief and love to flow. That's what rituals do. They allow grief and love to flow. And they're structures that allow that to happen. It's like they're the containment, they're the banks of the river. When you have a circle around a dead body and have a beautiful anointing vial, and each person gets to anoint them and say goodbye, right? That's a structure. What happens is grief and love are able to flow in that structure. So rituals are structures through which healing energy can flow, and healing energy is what needs to flow, grief and love. Sometimes there's resentment and estrangement and those levels, but if you dig down underneath those, it's still grief and love. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. And yeah, it's going to be fun to hear a bit from you, because I talk about all these things and I never know what's going to land or what's going to be some curiosity. So we'll go first to Chris, and if you can unmute yourself, Chris, and let me know your question.
First of all, thank you so much. I've written pages and pages of notes. This is very, very beautiful. And as probably most of us in the grief field are aware, the last 3 weeks have been horrific. And so what I like, if you have a minute, just to kind of discuss the ritual you might create for, or we can hold space for, a family who's had a senseless loss of a child. Thank you. Yeah, I know it's
no messing around.
Not to put you on the spot, but I mean, it happens, you know, and there's other times where children have been lost because of an accident or whatever, but what kind of ritual would best enfold and comfort and hold space for those families? And yeah, thank you.
So there's, I mean, the shootings in the last little while are tragedies and crises in families and in communities and in the country. And I'm in Canada, and it's for us too. I mean, we're the whole world is impacted by these. So there are different levels of rituals that would be appropriate at different levels for that. And just as a short, so when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were elected, I don't know if you remember the ritual they did the night before the election, where they went to the reflecting pool and they reflected on the deaths by COVID. That was a ritual at a country level. And that they understood the meaning of that symbolic gesture. But I'm going to bring this down and talk about at a family, because that's likely where most of us would be working. Oh yeah, I just feeling goosebumps all over me, feeling into this. Like it really is it's an important question and a challenging one. And those of us who are doing this work, faced with these enormous, almost explosions of trauma and energy and shock and grief, it's to go back to our core principles. What is happening here? Where is the block? Where's the issue where the energy is out of balance, and what needs to be done to resolve that? And the hugest thing that's happening is shock and surprise and trauma. And, you know, one of the definitions of trauma is too much, too fast. And that's exactly what's happening. So everything that can be done to slow things down, slow them down and stretch them out, and give every moment a really secure container. So the families of a child, the parents of a child who's been killed, are out of their minds. They cannot have any idea what's going on. So they need to be held and supported. Do this, do this, do this, right? This, so that's the really strong container. And to, if it's at all possible, to begin with, be with their body. And even in times where bodies are badly damaged, sometimes that's a body shrouded in a beautiful piece of fabric. Maybe there's a hand that can be out. Maybe, you know, in general, I tend to be a fan of not embalming. But sometimes when bodies have been damaged, they can be restored. And there can be a beautiful value for that. So there's definitely a place for that. Being able to be with that, be with their body. And, you know, sometimes it's, I had a colleague who was a chaplain, and he told me a story of working with a family who had a stillbirth. And the parents spent 4 or 5 hours putting lotion on their baby's body, touching her, feeling her, caring for her. And that, again, that's the gesture. They're integrating in their body and in their soul that she's dead. And they're doing it in a way that expresses their love for her. So slowing things down and stretching them out. And sometimes people need to be, I had friends who had also had a stillbirth, and this was maybe 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And they, instead of bringing the baby home, which they also could have done, the baby stayed in the morgue at the hospital, and they went there every day. And she sat in a rocking chair and held her baby, and they just processed. And if you can stretch that out long enough so that people are able to catch up, because you sent your child to school, your child is dead, that is so far to catch up. But if you can be with her and be doing gestures and be guided and held, people can't hold a space alone usually, then at some point, ideally, and it's with big trauma, you do what you can. At some point, by the time the child's body moves to the next step, like maybe it's in a casket or not. And sometimes, at home funerals, body's in the bed, it's there for a couple of days. Maybe his wife sleeps with his body for the first night. And then, at some point, then the body goes in the casket, and then it's open for another day. And then we ritualize the closing of the casket, and then it's closed in the house. And then we ritualize the removal of it. So it's identifying all the core moments that have a kind of peak of energy. When you see it, when you last see the body, when the body leaves your hand and goes to someone else, and if the body's cremated, or if the body is buried. Slowing that down and giving people enormous support to be able to be with that. The ritual might just be a super strong container and a structure and a gesture, because people, it's like when someone dies and everyone's standing around the bed, people don't know what to do. If you don't have a set of gestures that are built into your cultural pattern where you do this, they don't know what to do. So for someone to say, okay, now I'm going to invite you to anoint the body, right? Or now we're going to ask all of the friends and family to come, and in the backyard, we're going to have fabric and markers, and we're going to make prayer flags. And people are going to pour their heart out in prayer flags and allow the love to flow out your hand into the flags. And then we're going to string the flags from the clothesline, and the prayers are going to blow and carry her spirit. So then suddenly a prayer flag has a huge set of intentions around it. There's a gesture where people can take their grief, they move it through a soul-based art process, and then it flutters. So, I mean, that's just the beginning. That's just how you deal with the body in the first 2 days. And we could probably talk for 2 more hours about how to do that. Then there's the next and the next and the next and the next. But essentially, it's slow down so people can catch up and avoid anything that is more wrenching and shocking. I did a ceremony with a family where the grandmother died in hospice, and many, many ceremonies. And the last ceremony was the family with the transfer service. Transfer service came, the family pushed the gurney out, and then we handed her over to the transfer service. They loaded her in the van, and the family did that letting go. And then one daughter ran forward, just wailing, and grabbed onto the fender of the van. She wasn't ready. And so we just waited. I went and squatted down beside her. You just take all the time you need. And when people have that time, I mean, that's the scale of a child's death is so different than that. But eventually she was able to take her hand off. So she was lined up inside with what she did. So long set of answers there. But Chris, I hope that spoke to something. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Can you just feel how we've dropped into such a deeper field? And yeah, and in Canada, we can feel it, but I know it's a different thing. So my heart goes out to all of you. Okay, Jeannie.
Hi, I'd love to get any ideas for Father's Day, Sarah. And by the way, that last question and answer was unbelievably rich and beautiful. Thank you. So I just would love helping a friend out in Florida whose father died suddenly, and just trying to give her ideas, for her and her family, ideas of what to do for Father's Day.
So again, there's a little diagnosing, and keep your mute off, and we'll have a little talk. And so you just share as much. I mean, I want to respect confidentiality, but share as much and as generally as you like on the other family's behalf, because I know they're not here doing it. So we'll respect their particular details. Every family who's had a father die, even in the same kind of way, could potentially need a different ritual at Father's Day, because where things are blocked might be different. So I'm a long way from a kind of cookbook ritual process, and more an exploration of, okay, in this family, what's happening and what is the issue right here, right now, where things are stuck, excuse me, and how do we generate a ritual that addresses that? So would you like to share just a little bit in generalities about what's happening, and maybe I can riff off that a little bit?
I think so, because it actually pertains. And personally, 10 years ago, my husband dropped dead of a heart attack, and I've had 10 years to help my 2 children kind of get closure with that. So it's the same thing with this family in Florida. Both men died very suddenly and unexpectedly. So there's a longing to be able to say goodbye. You know, there's a longing to say goodbye.
And so if I were working with her, I was saying with this mom and this family, I'd want to know what had happened when he died and right after he died, and what happened with the funeral. And especially with sudden deaths, it can be really useful to actually have 3 funerals, to have the funeral a week after they die. Everyone's still reeling. And then maybe 6 months later, on their birthday or on your anniversary or on Father's Day or on Tuesday the 6th, whatever, someday, have another ceremony that's again a kind of integrating. You know, that might be, maybe that's when you bury the remains or scatter the ashes. And then another one a year, or you figure what the timing is, but it's so shocking that sometimes the funeral, at the end of an expected death, a funeral can be a real place of closure, because you've been able to prepare. And ideally, you and the conveyor belt are all moving at the same moment, and you can meet it and continue moving. With a sudden death, you're getting that slam experience. So I'd want to know what happened, how was that ritualized, and if that had been done in a kind of textbook, which is rare and almost impossible, textbook perfect way, they'd been well supported, they'd had all sorts of opportunities to say goodbye and to integrate and to absorb and to ritualize those processes, then there's a different kind of ritual you do on Father's Day. Father's Day can be a little less, there's not so much energy to integrate because it's sort of happened around the death. This is more memorializing and naming, appreciating, gratitude, remembering, finding the grief, finding the love, letting that all move. But it's not like a pent up wall of energy that hasn't been allowed to flow. If there was no flow, if that, and often people don't have support, and it is so shocking that the goodbyes didn't really happen here the way they needed to. And so Father's Day, that energy just kind of zips a little below the surface, just barely, and people are sort of holding on the top, but they haven't really done their processing. And at Father's Day, it pops back up again. And we think it's Father's Day, but it's just this energy of grief that hasn't been processed. So I don't want to sound like I'm evading your answer, which is please give me a ritual, but it just really all depends. And if what's more likely is that they got moderate or not even great support around when it happens, and there's more integrating and goodbyes to be done, then I would suggest not, we have a picture of what Father's Day is. It's a celebration of fathers and our relationship and our connection. And even when someone's dead, Father's Day can be that if everything else is processed, but not to let that energy of Father's Day influence this, because really what they probably need is a grief ritual. They probably need another integrating goodbye ritual. And Father's Day has brought it up, but Father's Day is not the frame for it. It's what you love and miss about it, and an opportunity to grieve and let that flow. And then, so when you get really clear about what your intention is, then you can start to look at who the family is and what their values and symbols are. And then you can develop a ritual using their values and symbols. So maybe it's fishing, maybe it's football, maybe it's classic rock, maybe it's pancake breakfasts. You find for them, once you know the way you want the energy to be supported, then you find a gesture that you can do with that intention. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And you've given me, and I'm sure everyone else out there, a lot to think about.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's really hard to just say, here's the ritual. I mean, sometimes at some places, when someone dies, there are some kind of classic places where the archetypal energy is so, it's just what happens, that we can come up with rituals that are more replicable for those situations. I do animal euthanizing rituals. Those can be a little more replicable, but I'll speak for myself, but I wonder if it resonates for people here too. Growing up and living in a culture that doesn't have ritual practices, that doesn't have established ways that a community comes together when someone dies. Whether that's a church bell rings and the church ladies make casseroles and the churchmen build a coffin and dig a hole and the whole community. I mean, even those, not so long ago in my family's history, gave us something to do. They were more logistical. They weren't, we light a candle and open a window so their soul can release. All those, if we don't have any of those, we're in a place where we're reinventing them. And rituals are stronger when they have history. They're stronger when there's a lineage and the field gets amplified. It's like the grooves in the record get deeper. And once you get in that groove, you can just follow it. There's these grooves of consciousness almost. So when we're creating a completely new ritual for this family in this situation, for this Father's Day, it has a certain amount of weight, and it has probably a lot more weight and significance than anything else they'd get. But it's also very different from a culture that has a set of established rituals around what happens at death, has a set of grieving rituals for the family after the grief, where they don't just get 4 days and they are suddenly expected to, after the funeral, pop back up and be good capitalists again, back on the assembly line. We'd have a series of ritual practices, and then in that context, we'd have a Father's Day practice that also honored all the dead fathers in our lives every year, not just the year after Dad dies, but we have a lot of dead fathers and grandfathers in our lives, and maybe Father's Day in general honors them, and then it's not so fraught with this most recent death, because we've known it. All our lives, Father's Days have included dead fathers, and now Father's Day includes a most recent dead father. It's a sadder, more recent pain, but dead fathers are part of the process. We might have in a culture that has these built-in or established, we might have some kind of ancestor day in general. And lots of cultures have those, where everyone goes and has a picnic in the graveyard and cleans up, or you have a meal and you set a place for the dead. So when we think about a kind of culture where we're doing that all the time, we're preparing ourselves emotionally and spiritually for death when it comes. And we're not there yet. And I feel like my work and the work of many other people in the end of life space is about creating new models that maybe over time will get some traction. And I think about birth doulas and birth midwives and how that's been happening long enough in dominant culture. It's happening a lot longer in other cultures for sure, but where there are starting to be rituals that get established and have some traction and some currency. And maybe we can start to move those with death because they're absolutely stronger. They're stronger when they are building on an energy of repetition and consistency. There's a field of energy that grows around them. But until we get that, being a little more improvisational, using those same archetypal roots of ritual and the archetype of ritual and death and loss, really those archetypes, we can go a long way. Astrid.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, from my own part, in terms of ritual that societies used to have, I miss the wearing black after someone dies. And not so long ago, I read an article by a young writer in New York, and she says, well, I want to wear black, but everybody wears black all the time. So how do I make it visible without having to really explain things? And I'm not sure, what do you think of that? And how do we go back to that? If that's something, because it's a ritual per se, and it also indicates right away that this person is in a different space, in a different frame.
Beautiful question. I can see a little video coming out about that. That's a great one to explore. So let's talk about two parts of that. One is wearing black at the funeral, and one is wearing black as a statement of mourning. And I have quite a soapbox, you may expect. You may not be surprised that I can get in around funerals. And I'm a big fan of the word funeral. Funerals can have laughter and celebration in them, but they are grief rituals. And when we frame it as a celebration of life, sometimes that comes with this unspoken idea that it's not going to be sad. Mm-hmm. And that if the funeral is not sad, if the funeral is short and kind of shallow, as opposed to not going deep into our grief, the funeral is short and shallow, our grief will be short and shallow. We'll just not let any of it happen, which is not, of course, how it works. Grief works by being given a space to move, it clears itself out, and then it's clearer. So, I've been to funerals where you're not allowed to wear black. You have to wear bright colors, and there can be some value too in something. And I love Catholic funerals for this, because a good big old Catholic funeral in a cathedral, everybody's in black. And it says something, it does something. Rituals, the costume and the regalia makes a difference. When we're in a room full of people wearing black, they say, okay, I put on my black go to funeral clothes to come to this. I'm coming to a different space. A funeral is not a daily life. It's a different time and place, and I dress differently for it. I come with a different consciousness. I come into a ritual space. So black at funerals, and that's, as you can guess, I generally almost always wear black at funerals unless there's some other good reason not to. So black at funerals is one thing. And then there's mourning attire. And I'm really fascinated with this idea that people wear black all the time. So it loses its symbolic value. And I know I've seen little movements of people making pins or bracelets or something, because what the classic black for a year say, and that's a ritual statement, what that gesture says is, FYI, I am not the same on the inside as I was when I was wearing my regular clothes. I am different on the inside, and treat me differently on the outside. And you can tell I'm different on the inside because I'm different on the outside. So it's another way of inside and outside matching. Don't expect me to be who I was before this person died, because I'm not. And so it's a kindness to the the person who's wearing the mourning robes, mourning clothes, but it's also a way of keeping grief and loss visible in our culture, in a culture that wants to push that away. We want sick people, dying people, dead people. Really, they don't get a lot of airtime with anti-aging commercials and you can stay young and beautiful forever commercials. But if someone is wearing black with a statement that someone has died, and in 100 people, there might be 8 who are, I don't know what the numbers are, it says this is real, this has happened in our culture all the time. And it gives us an understanding that when it's our turn, when someone we love dies, there'll be a tool, right? There's a practice, there's a ritual practice that I can just lean into. It's a structure that gives a framework for me to allow my energy to flow. It also, I think, is a tool to build compassion, because grief can be very isolating, where, if someone you love has died, there's that classic moment when you walk into the grocery store and you look around and you think, oh my God, everybody's just buying broccoli. Don't they know? Like, it is not the same world. I am not just buying, like, everything has changed. And if we looked around the produce department and we saw 3 people wearing black, there'd be for me anyway, there'd be oh, don't know what your story is, but it's something. And I bet it's sad and hard. And so my heart goes out to you. And I might be a little more patient than I might normally be. And I might be a little kinder. And it might build a culture of kindness and compassion. So I don't have an answer for the fashion dilemma of how do we wear black when everybody's wearing black? But this is a really wholehearted vote for making visible grief, whether it's an armband or a pin or a something, right? There's a new cultural model that's asking to be developed so that we can start to develop a kind of literacy and capacity around grief and loss in this larger culture. So great question, Astrid. I like that. I haven't had a chance to riff on that yet. So we have just a few minutes left. Any other either questions or reflections or comments or stories from your own experience, just in our last 5 minutes? Rosalinda.
Yeah. I come from a different culture, and I noticed that when I came to the States, people are having a much more difficult time accepting death than where I come from. And I think it has a lot to do with the established rituals, as you mentioned. After the funeral, people come together, family, friends, and the community, to pray together for 9 days or 9 nights. And then after the 40th day, we come together again to pray. And then after 1 year, the same thing, people come together and pray. And aside from praying, people actually socialize, and it's just like a party, actually. So especially when I was a kid, I really didn't feel that much of a loss of a loved one, because I could see people actually partying, coming together and enjoying themselves, aside from the praying together. So when I came to the States and spent my husband, after Lewis, buried here in the States, and the entire family and friends and the community came together, but there was really no coming together as a prayer, service. And so it was really completely different. And I think that's probably why people here are having a much more difficult time, because of the lack of established rituals, than coming from a culture where we have rituals, aside from wearing black during the funeral and up to a certain number of days.
Well, thank you so much for that. As you were talking about those rhythms of after the funeral and the 9 days and the 40 days in the year, I just feel a shift in my body of like relaxing into a structure that would hold, and how how much grief I feel in dominant culture that I'm embedded in. We don't have that. And it sounds to me that it sounds like it's something that everybody knows. It's just, as a little kid, this happens. When it becomes something that everybody can participate in, and we live in a culture, there's a lot of space for diversity, so we need to make space for the different ways of doing it, but there to be an option of something that's done regularly, it gives an incredible structure. And that's really interesting, your reflection that it makes a difference, you having experienced it here and having experienced it there. So thank you very much for that. Anybody else? No? Okay, Astrid, I think I'll give it back to you.
Yes, I think so. We have reached basically the end of our time here together. Sarah, I thanking you so much for spending this time here with us. It's been very rich. I took lots of notes too. I love you, the way you talk, unconditional cooperation with the inevitable.
Although the actual quote is the unavoidable, but
yeah.
The oral tradition, these things get morphed.
Yeah, that's right, they do. So thank you so much for being here, with us. I want to thank everybody who came and attended. I hope that you found some of what you're looking for, and I encourage you to continue to check in with us. Our next speaker series will be August 10, same time, noon, and we're going to have Gabby Jimenez. She's a nurse from California, and she will talk about heart-centered end-of-life care. Again, you will need to register on our website for that. I see a note here on the chat room. Does Sarah Kerr has a website? Here we go. Thank you, Sarah. And let's see, I just want to quickly see if there is anything else. I think this is good here. All right. Well,
I'll just say,
go ahead.
Because this is being recorded and people later might not see the chat, the website is sacreddeathcare.com, the Center for Sacred Death Care.
Yeah, and I can put that in the, when I send the recording, and yeah. Okay, well, here's another message for everybody that you may read. Jeannie Canepa says she's taken 3 classes from Sarah and highly recommends. So yay. Great recommendation. Chris.
Yeah. Can we forward the recording to those that work in this field? Is that okay? If they weren't here?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, okay. And everybody who was registered will get the recording, but the recording is also going to be put on our website. So it's going to be available to everybody. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
John, have you got a question?
Yes, I do. I wanted to just say thank you very much, of course. I mean, you're a great speaker and express things so well. Very engaging, beyond your obvious knowledge, and good stories. And I also wanted to ask about, do you know where the Port Angeles ferry is?
I have heard that it exists, but I have not yet discovered the where.
Ah, okay. Well, if you do, I'm sure there's a lot of people in this area that would love to engage you face to face. If we can get you out here from time to time.
Anything's possible. Now we're getting more travel opportunities. So I'll keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Okay, well, I think that we can end this series on, now. And thank you again, Sarah. That was really excellent. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for all your time and attention.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes I find people have to be removed at the end because they might not even still be here. But just to check in if there's anything.
No, I think this was excellent. I mean, you kept us, engaged. Yeah. It's, it's interesting how some people want to have a PowerPoint and put, ideas and thoughts and images, which, images can be very powerful, but the way you speak is it's full of images. So, it really worked. It was beautiful.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. Well, I always love it. And there were some great questions in there. Yours, that black one, it hasn't, I thought about it, but I hadn't really floated it into my surface. So there's something, I'm going to explore that a little bit more.
Yeah, it kind of came to me because I had read this article about this young woman in New York, and she really wanted to grieve, and she didn't want to explain to people where I lost my mother. She just wanted people to know right away, without having to talk. Talking is too painful sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's how that came up. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks. Hello, Ed. Can you unmute yourself? Hello, Ed.
Oh.
Hi. So I know that you wanted to join in on the speaker series.
Was hoping to hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. It's a little muffled on my end. Let me see if okay. Let me see if that's a little better.